Chapter 2: Primitive Solutions. 3 days after what was now being called the Atlantic Event, the first steam-powered generators came online in Washington, D.C. Black smoke billowed from hastily constructed smokestacks as coal-fired boilers turned massive turbines. The technology was antiquated, inefficient, and dirty, but it worked. The White House became the first building to regain power, followed by the Pentagon, key military installations, and selected hospitals. The power wasn't stable, and it certainly wasn't clean, but it provided the basic electricity needed to begin coordinating a response. Similar efforts were underway across the Atlantic. In London, the British government had repurposed old coal plants in the Midlands, creating a primitive but functional electrical grid that powered essential services. British engineering firms worked around the clock to design and build mechanical alternatives to electronic systems. Prime Minister Tennant addressed Parliament, which now met in Birmingham beyond the blackout zone.
Britain faced its darkest hour once before and prevailed,
he declared, deliberately echoing Churchill.
We shall overcome this challenge as we have overcome all others, with ingenuity, determination, and the unbreakable spirit of the British people.
In Russia, President Kokolov took a different approach. With much of Western Russia still affected by expanding blackouts, he relocated key government functions to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. From this new command center, he coordinated Russia's response and calculated its opportunities.
The Americans are isolated,
he told his inner circle.
Their navy is crippled, their air force is mostly grounded. NATO is fragmented without communications. We must secure our interests while they are weak.
Russian mechanized divisions began moving toward their western borders, officially for humanitarian assistance to affected regions in Belarus and Ukraine, but Western observers noted their distinctly non-humanitarian composition. China, meanwhile, implemented what it called Operation Helping Hand. Cargo ships loaded with generators, medical supplies, and food departed from Shanghai and other eastern ports, bound for affected regions across Europe and Africa. Each shipment came with technical advisors and security teams, extending China's influence under the guise of humanitarian aid. President Trumsky addressed the nation via radio broadcast, using equipment specially designed to function with the unstable power supply.
My fellow Americans, we face an unprecedented crisis. An attack on our way of life has occurred, and we will find those responsible. The United States will not be cowed. We will rebuild. We will restore power, and we will have justice.
Behind the confident words lay a stark reality. America's global influence was waning by the hour, as China and Russia filled the power vacuum, both literally and figuratively. The speech struck a defiant tone, but behind closed doors, the administration remained baffled. The AERT had yet to determine the cause of the blackout, though theories abounded. Most centered around some form of advanced weapons, technology deployed by a hostile nation.
The Chinese have denied involvement,
reported Secretary of State Andra Phillips during the morning briefing.
So have the Russians. For what it's worth, they're experiencing the same chaos along their Atlantic coasts.
What about diplomatic channels?
Asked the president.
Limited and deteriorating,
Phillips answered.
We've established rudimentary communication with London using modified radio equipment. Prime Minister Tenet reports Chinese humanitarian teams are already operating in Liverpool and Bristol. They brought their own security forces, heavily armed for humanitarian workers.
And the Russians.
Moscow is making moves in Eastern Europe, military movements under the guise of emergency response. NATO is trying to coordinate a response, but without proper communications, it's fragmented at best. The UK is prioritizing domestic concerns over alliance obligations.
Can we blame them?
muttered the defense secretary.
We're all fighting for survival here.
What about direct communication with Moscow and Beijing?
Trumsky pressed.
We've sent diplomatic couriers to both capitals via mechanically modified aircraft.
Phillips replied.
The Russian response was non-committal. The Chinese expressed deep concern and offered humanitarian assistance, with conditions that would effectively give their technical teams access to sensitive infrastructure and military installations.
Wolves in sheep's clothing.
Trumsky growled.
They're exploiting this crisis to redraw the global order.
It may be worse than that, sir.
The intelligence director interjected.
Our limited surveillance capabilities show Russian and Chinese military forces conducting joint exercises in the Sea of Japan. They're acting with an unusual level of coordination.
Of course they deny it.
The president replied.
What about our cyber team? Any progress?
Dr. Maya Patel, the newly appointed head of the Cyber Response Division, stepped forward.
Sir, we've begun examining affected electronic devices using the new power sources. We're seeing something unusual.
Define unusual,
demanded the president.
The core programming in these devices has been altered at a fundamental level. It's not just that they've been disabled, they've been reprogrammed to self-destruct. And the code, it's unlike anything we've seen before. It's not following conventional programming logic.
Hackers,
concluded the president.
has to be.
Dr. Patel hesitated.
Perhaps, sir. But if so, they're using methods we've never encountered. The code appears to be evolving.
Evolving? How?
It's rewriting itself in response to our attempts to analyze it. Almost like
Like what, Doctor?
an organism adapting to its environment.
The president dismissed the notion with a wave of his hand.
Find me the hackers responsible. I want raids conducted on every known hacker collective. Anonymous, Lulzsec, Red Hacker, all of them. Someone knows something.
Within 24 hours, raids were conducted across the globe. Known hackers were arrested, their equipment confiscated. The administration presented these actions as progress, but the arrested hackers appeared genuinely bewildered by the accusations.
You think we did this?
Laughed Marcus Green, a notorious hacker known as Phantom, during his interrogation.
We couldn't do this if we wanted to. This isn't a hack. This is something else entirely.
Similar scenes played out in the United Kingdom, where British intelligence conducted raids on suspected hacker collectives in Manchester and Glasgow. Prime Minister Tenet, under immense public pressure, authorized the operations despite reservations from civil liberties advocates within his government.
We cannot afford to overlook any possibility.
Tenet told his cabinet.
If there's even a remote chance these groups have information about the event, we must act.
In Russia, President Kokolov took a more direct approach. Known hackers were rounded up by security services and subjected to harsh interrogation methods. Many were never seen again. When human rights organizations protested, Kokolov dismissed their concerns.
Russia faces an existential threat,
he declared.
The niceties of peacetime have no place in such a crisis.
China, meanwhile, presented itself as the voice of reason. President Chen publicly criticized both Western and Russian approaches.
In times of global crisis, we need cooperation, not accusations,
she stated during a rare international broadcast.
China stands ready to work with all nations to resolve these crises through scientific collaboration and mutual assistance.
Behind this magnanimous facade, however, Chinese intelligence services conducted their own aggressive operations against domestic and foreign hacker groups, though with characteristic discretion. As the raids continued, public sentiment began to turn. With limited power restored only to government facilities and hospitals, civilians remained in the dark. Protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators demanding action to restore basic services. "Power to the people!" read signs illuminated by candlelight in Times Square. "Human rights, not witch hunts," proclaimed banners outside FBI field offices, where hackers were being detained. In London, thousands gathered outside Parliament buildings, their faces illuminated by gas lamps and candles. "Help us before helping others," their signs read, a direct criticism of the tenant government's decision to accept Chinese assistance while British citizens suffered. Meanwhile, Sandy Reeves had taken matters into her own hands. Her small laboratory near Portland, Maine, had a unique advantage: a prototype wave energy converter she had been testing for marine research. With some modifications, she managed to generate enough electricity to power her basic equipment. The specimens she had collected told a disturbing story. Under her electron microscope, she identified strange microorganisms in the tissue samples, entities that resembled mechanical constructs, but appeared organic in nature.
"What are you?"
she whispered, adjusting the microscope's focus. The organisms resembled nanobots, but they moved and divided like living cells. They integrated seamlessly with the host tissue, rewriting the creature's DNA in real time. Even more disturbing were the anatomical changes in the specimens. Creatures that had spent their evolutionary history in the ocean depths were developing structures resembling primitive lungs. Their gill systems were shrinking while new respiratory systems formed. Sandy documented her findings meticulously, but her attempts to contact government officials proved futile. With communications still down across most of the eastern seaboard, her discoveries remained isolated in her small, coastal laboratory. As she worked, a new development arose. Reports of a strange illness began to emerge from the few hospitals with power. People were reporting breathing difficulties, unexplained fevers, and disorientation. The symptoms didn't match any known pathogen, and doctors were baffled. The mysterious illness wasn't limited to American shores. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service reported similar cases in coastal communities from Dover to Edinburgh. British researchers, working with primitive equipment powered by coal and steam, noted the prevalence of symptoms in communities with direct access to Atlantic waters.
"It's spreading inland,"
reported Dr. James Harrington, chief medical advisor to the Prime Minister.
"Initially confined to coastal areas, but now we're seeing cases in Birmingham, over 100 miles from the sea."
Across the Channel, French authorities reported identical patterns. In St. Petersburg, Russian medical facilities were overwhelmed with patients exhibiting the same respiratory distress. President Kokolov, ever paranoid, became convinced this was a biological attack coordinated with the electromagnetic disruption.
First they blind us, then they poison us.
He told his defense counsel.
We must prepare appropriate responses.
Chinese intelligence, monitoring Russian communications through their humanitarian teams in Eastern Europe, noted Kokolov's increasing paranoia with concern. President Chen ordered accelerated research into the illness, deploying medical teams to affected areas with a dual mission: provide genuine assistance while gathering critical intelligence. At a secure facility in Shanghai, Chinese scientists made the same discovery Sandy was approaching in her main laboratory: the presence of unknown microorganisms in tissue samples from affected patients. But without access to the deep-sea specimens Sandy was studying, they couldn't make the crucial connection between marine life and human symptoms. Unknown to Sandy, the same microorganisms she had discovered in the deep-sea creatures were already finding their way into human hosts across continents. The transformation had begun, transcending national boundaries and geopolitical rivalries in its inexorable advance.